Okay, so let's talk about three acronyms. The first one's going to be OJ, this guy, OJ Simpson. The second's going to be DNA, as in DNA forensics. DNA isn't infallible, as we'll see. And the last one is GIGO, which if you haven't heard, it means garbage in, garbage out. No matter what, if you have the perfect artificial intelligence algorithm or the best science, still, if you put garbage into the system, what you're going to get out is going to be garbage as well. And this case really demonstrates it. And here is the quote from Barry Scheck, who really made his name from the O.J. Simpson case and really kicked off a new era in wrongful convictions by the work of the Innocence Project that really was boosted by the work in the O.J. Simpson case and the notoriety that he and Peter Neufeld got from that case. Here's what he says about it. We didn't challenge the underlying reliability of DNA testing methods. We attacked the way that evidence was gathered and processed. We had a 21st century technology and 19th century evidence collection methods. So here's OJ. This is actually a picture of OJ on one of his better days, probably. It's just a few months before the murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her partner, Ron Goldman. This picture was taken when Mr. Simpson was participating in a ceremony associated with the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo. This was a good day for him. And then there was a bad day for him. This is the mug shot that was taken the day after the murders when O.J. Simpson was arrested by the Los Angeles Police Department on suspicion of having murdered his ex-wife and Mr. Goldman. The crime scene was a mess. There was, as you can see here, there was blood all over this walkway. I'm not going to show too much more. You can Google if you want to see more of that kind of thing. That's not what this video is about. The idea being that we need to know is that the assailant used some kind of large knife to kill the victims, which means that there was a lot of blood everywhere, that inevitably the victim's blood got on the assailant. And inevitably, almost always, when this kind of stabbing event occurs, the assailant will also cut themselves because blood is slippery and other things like that. It's very, very common for the assailant's blood to be found at the crime scene in different ways. And actually, there's several different stories of wrongful convictions where that occurs. In this particular case, which wasn't, of course, a wrongful conviction, Simpson was not convicted of the murders of his ex-wife and Mr. Goldman. Nonetheless, a lot of the same kinds of things that happen in wrongful convictions happened in the O.J. Simpson case, which is why it's interesting from my perspective as a kind of a miscarriage of justice, because if you believe Simpson was innocent, then the justice system clearly was going after a man who should not have been the suspect. Or if you believe, like 99% of the people in the world, that Simpson was guilty, then it's a miscarriage of justice because the victims didn't get the justice that they deserved by Simpson having to answer for the murders. So either way, it's a miscarriage of justice that matters to us, what happened around this walkway and the other areas around Brentwood in Los Angeles that day. One of the things that we will see here, this is actually a picture of the infamous car chase. And if you were around at that time, you would know this is 40 years ago now, right? How amazing this was. This was an event. This was a national event, this car chase, which happened actually a fair amount after the initial murders and arrests, when it was clear that Simpson was going to be arrested again, and this time would be brought to trial for murder. And so he actually engaged in this car chase. What's interesting from our perspective is that this Bronco actually was also part of the crime scene, because of what is all over this walkway. Some of it got all over this Bronco. In fact, there were several bloodstains found inside the Bronco and around the Bronco as well. And there were bloodstains found back at the O.J. Simpson residence as well that were relevant to the investigation. So the key element in terms of what we're worrying about today, I'm not going to go over the entire case because that would take several out. There have been lots of great movies and documentaries running through that. We're going to focus in on what happened with the forensic science. And this map is key to it. This is a map of Los Angeles. And so you can see here over to the left, this is where the murders occurred over in the Brentwood section of Los Angeles near the Pacific Ocean, one of the most luxurious parts, and the highest income, whatever parts of Los Angeles. And then across town, where the downtown area, if you can call, is there a downtown in Los Angeles? Well, to the extent that there is, it would be over here, which is where there are three places that are of interest to us that uh, played a role in how forensic science was being done at that time. These two that are south of the highway are the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters and something called the Parker Center, which was basically next door to the headquarters. The Parker Center was kind of an administrative building that supported the headquarters. It is where, on the day after the murders, OJ Simpson was arrested. He was interrogated for about 2.5 hours, and the Parker Center is where his blood was drawn. A reference sample of his blood was drawn that day at the Parker Center. The Piper Technical Center over here, it's not too far away, maybe a mile or two away from the other two places. That's where the crime laboratory, or at least the part of the laboratory that dealt with biological evidence, was located. And that's where the evidence first started after it had been collected from the various places where there was a crime scene. So this is the Parker Center. Simpson was brought into the Parker Center to have his blood drawn. At the Parker Center, there were two individuals who interacted with him and with his reference sample that are important to our story. So the first is Detective Philip Van Adder, this gentleman here, and this next gentleman. This is the best picture I was able to find on him. Is a man by the name of Thano Paratas, who was a nurse who worked for the city of Los Angeles, collecting blood samples, such as the reference sample that was collected from O.J. Simpson. So what happened was that Paratas, and what he collected was a pretty standard thing. So if most of us have had blood taken for medical purposes, it's really not that different. The vial that was used was had a volume that could take about 8 milliliters worth of blood. And so, technically speaking, usually what one would do would be to fill up the vial with the full 8 milliliters of blood. But the vial, as it arrived at the crime lab later on, only had 6.5 milliliters of blood. Mr. Paradas did not make any notes about whether he had collected 6.5 or 8 milliliters, and he didn't really remember whether he had taken 6.5 or 8 milliliters. And that became the start of the issues that we will see in how the crime scene work was done, how all of the collection work was done, and frankly, how a lot of the forensic science was done in the case, unfortunately. What I call the garbage in, basically, unfortunately. The other thing that Mr. Paratas failed to do was to secure the sample properly. So he did secure it within a baggie and that kind of thing, and the sample was sealed by the time it got to the crime laboratory, but it never really, we don't think it was properly secured at the Parker Center, and it was not entered into evidence at the Parker Center. It never really got entered into evidence until it got over here to the Piper Center. And that's key, because one of the key elements, one of the most important principles in forensic science is chain of custody. So you need to be able to say, this is the provenance of the sample, either the sample as it came from the crime scene, or the sample, in this case, as it was a reference sample that was collected from Mr. Simpson. So you need to be able to check afterward from the documentation and so on that the same sample that was taken from Simpson was the one that was used in the analysis work and then was reported in court. And so being very careful about that was extremely important. The fact that the basic procedures that you would expect for that collection weren't followed raised questions for a very, very long time after this. So after Mr. Paradas collected the sample from Mr. Simpson, he gave it to Van Adder. Now, Philip Van Adder had already pretty much taken over as the lead detective in the case by this point. He had actually gone to the Simpson residence the previous night. He had what had happened was is that the kids there were two children involved who were children of the Simpsons. And when the police found the bodies, they checked out the residence of Nicole Brown Simpson and found the kids. The kids were brought to a police station for custody to make sure they were safe. And what Van Andel said is, he went to the Simpson residence basically to let him know what had happened and so that he could retrieve his children. To let him know that the children were safe and that kind of thing. And he actually wound up going into the residence, and there's a lot of criticism of that, whether he had actually started to treat Simpson as a suspect before he really had any evidence. There was a reason for the police to be suspicious about Simpson. He had been involved in domestic violence incidents involving Nicole Brown Simpson prior to the murders. Several of the police officers involved in the investigation were well aware of that fact, had been involved in some of those responses. And so there was a level of suspicion that was there from the get-go, as well as the fact that there's a kind of the first thing you think of in any situation, whether it involved Mr. Simpson or somebody else, is that murder most often comes about from a personal relationship. And so it was reasonable to consider Simpson as a suspect regardless. But did Van Adder kind of jump the gun on that? And was his behavior appropriate that night and afterward? Here today, the day after the murders that we're talking about, he received the sample, whether it had 6.5 milliliters or 8 milliliters of blood, from that involved OJ Simpson. And so he had a very simple task, is what he had to do. And that is he had to get it over to this, which is the Piper Technical Center. And you can see the downtown area of in this picture behind the center, where that's where he had to deliver this sample. But he did not go to the Piper Technical Center, which would have been the natural thing to do, given that it's like right there, right? I mean, it's Los Angeles traffic. Who knows? Maybe it would have been a 15-minute drive. I don't know. Doesn't matter. He did not make that drive, and instead, what he did was probably the worst possible thing he could have done at that time if he wanted to raise questions about the validity of the reference sample and all the rest of the evidence that was collected in the case. It was the worst possible thing. He went from the Parker Center to Brentwood. He actually wound up at O.J. Simpson's residence, where the police technicians, evidence technicians, and crime scene people were collecting evidence from the home. And I don't know what Van Adder was thinking. Maybe it was just being efficient, right? He knew all the stuff from the home was going to have to go over to the Piper Center, and so why not just throw it in there? He needed to give it to them so the whole stuff could go over to the Piper Center. I don't know. Maybe he, wanted to check out what was going on at the home. Maybe he was on his way home from work, and that was on his way. There's a million reasons why. No matter what his reasons why, that was not a good move. It was a really, really poor move for him to make that long drive all the way across town instead of just dropping it off at the Piper Center as he should have done. And again, part of what was going on here is that everything that was going on around this crime scene and the situation in Brentwood was to some extent very, very localized. And I think I've got an actual map of the general area here. This is the area around where Nicole Brown Simpson actually lived. So this is Bundy Drive over here, and the condos that she lived in. She and Mr. Goldman had, I think, dinner up on the main drag here, San Vicente. Is that how you say it? Boulevard. They had dinner up there, and they were coming back from that night to her home, to her condominium. So yeah, the Mezzaluna restaurant is what it was called, and then the condo is down here, and just not too far away. I mean, you can see this is just a few blocks away is where Simpson's estate was. Now, again, this raises questions that says Simpson had opportunity. If he, even if he was just sitting at home watching a show or whatever else he was doing, it would not take him very long to get down to where the murders occurred and then go back home. And so the sequence of events that might have happened that night was relatively easy in terms of a crime reconstruction perspective. He wound up taking a flight out of town that night and then coming back the next morning. And that wound up being a whole nother kind of soap opera within the case that's outside of what we need to worry about. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that these were all together raised suspicions about Simpson. However, it also raised suspicions about Van Adder, because if he was coming across town from the LAPD headquarters and the Parker Center to Brentwood to the house, he could easily have um, contaminated samples down here at these other scenes, or there's a million things he could have done within this little area. Also, there's no reason you couldn't reconstruct a set of movements of Mr. Van Adder, of Detective Van Adder, that could raise questions. And the fact that he was carrying around O.J. Simpson's blood while he was out here doesn't make that any better, obviously. And so what happened next is he goes to the Rockingham home, and this is an outline of the home. I think it's actually been torn down now, so it doesn't even exist anymore. You can see here different places where they collected evidence from around the home. He parks, and it still has the sample, and he winds up going inside to meet up with these two individuals. So let me make sure. So this gentleman, right, this gentleman here is Dennis Fung, and this lady here is Andrea Mazzola. And their names aren't that important, but the problem that they were doing most of the work in terms of overseeing the collection of evidence from the crime scene. Mr. Fung was the senior person there. Ms. Mazzola was actually fairly new to the police force. She had only been working, I think, something like 9 months at the time. So she was still kind of in a learning phase. And she even admitted after the fact that some of the things that she did wound up being questionable. For example, when taking a swab of some of the blood stains, I think from the Bronco, she used the same swab to collect 3 different stains, which is really, really bad, right? Because what you want to do is if the whole point of this is, well, is this stain from this individual? Was it a mixture? And how does it fit into the reconstruction of what might have happened at the residence or after the crime, whatever it was. So you collect individual samples. I mean, in some respects, it's common sense onto individual swabs. What is LAPD running out of money to buy swabs? You don't. I mean, here the most high-profile case. Possibly in Los Angeles history, and she's saving money on swabs, right? So things like that. She said even herself after the fact that she was not she didn't feel like she had been trained well enough. She didn't feel she had the experience that necessary for this kind of a high profile case. She made mistakes, and to some extent you can say, well, Mr. Fung really was more responsible than her for some of the issues that may have gone on. But in any case, so the journey of the O.J. Simpson reference blood came to O.J. Simpson's residence, and then Van Adder gives it to Mr. Fung. And Mr. Fung then gives the vial to Miss Mazzola because she's kind of the tech and she's kind of collecting things and everything like that. And what she does is really extraordinary as well. She puts it into basically a garbage bag with a bunch of the evidence that had been collected from the Rockingham estate, which is mind boggling to, at this point in the investigation, for no reason whatsoever, to mix and match reference samples out in the field with the evidence samples is, again, raising common sense questions about what the heck are you even thinking about the control here, especially given the fact that still the reference sample had not been entered into evidence and the chain of custody had not yet been established. And so what the heck? Now, when this came up in the trial, and you can see these are actual pictures of the individuals from when they testified in the trial, the jury was rapt about all this. They were like, what in the world? Because Shaq and the rest of the defense team did a really good job asking like what were you thinking? And honestly, what were they thinking? And so in any case, what we have now is we have this trash bag, garbage, which it has completely compromised at this point, just even by itself, by the poor procedures that were being followed by the Los Angeles Police Department. That's where, so you had the reference sample, and then you had all the samples from around the Rockingham estate, all sitting in there all together. And at that point, the bag and other evidence was put into an LAPD crime van, and finally that van makes its way across town to the Piper Center. And this is, so finally at this point, what we have is we have the garbage bag actually getting to the crime scene where it can, not to the crime scene, but to the crime laboratory where it can be analyzed along with the rest of the evidence. And I can't emphasize enough. This is garbage in. Okay. Now, I may be exaggerating there a little bit. It isn't like the evidence was of no value in a broader sense of the term, but it had been so compromised to this point by the way in which it had been handled, by the amateurish way that it had been handled, that it never really had the impact that it might have, even if they had used some of the more modern techniques for DNA analysis. You still would have had problems, but at least it was now in the laboratory. You think, well, okay, cool. Now things can get better. They did not get better, unfortunately. So what the individual who opened up the evidence was this man by the name of Colin Yamuchi. And Yamuchi himself also made some very simple mistakes in how he handled the evidence. First of all, when he opened up that reference vial, he spilled blood from the reference vial, and just by itself contaminating an awful lot, or potentially contaminating the entirety of his lab bench and potentially some of the evidence. He was extraordinarily sloppy and could not really tell on the stand when he had changed gloves in between his handling of that and his spillage and his handling of other evidence. So again, if there's any potential for cross-contamination, you need to be able to limit that as much as possible. He really didn't have good answers for how he limited cross-contamination, which was problematic, especially at this time for LAPD, because the laboratory had already come under fire before the Simpson case for that very problem, for the cross-contamination problem, and therefore should have already implemented the protocols necessary to make sure they didn't have cross-contamination by, changing gloves when you spill and making sure that you don't cross-contaminate. And so one of the things that happened, so one of the other questions that was raised about Van Adder and his actions around this time, he also went to the coroner's office and picked up the reference samples from the victims, from Nicole Brown Simpson and Mr. Goldman, and brought those into the laboratory as well. And again, without necessarily following the protocols one would hope he would, to make sure that there was no cross-contamination problems out in the field or chain of custody problems and things of that nature. And in fact, later on when DNA testing was done on the reference samples themselves from Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, it was found that there was foreign DNA in those reference samples. Now, was that foreign DNA put there during the autopsy, during the collection? Was it put in there at the crime laboratory? Was it put in there when Venator was transporting them, or some other time that we don't know about? The answer is don't know, and we're not going to know to this day really why there was contamination there. The contamination actually was consistent with OJ Simpson's blood. However, the DNA technology at the time, as we'll see, really didn't have the power necessary to be able to say it was OJ Simpson's blood that had contaminated those samples, because it could have been any of millions, frankly, of other people who could have contributed that contaminated DNA. All we know is there was foreign DNA in the samples of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman from the autopsy, which again completely compromised all of the DNA analysis as well as the serological analysis that was attempted in the case, and also raised this whole question of contamination in the laboratory that was from both from Mr. Yamuchi's work with the reference sample, where he's basically spilling it all over the place, as well as the other issues regarding contamination that occurred, because we know about at the very least that, as I say, two of the reference samples were contaminated. This is actually a still from the movie The Thing. This is why I thought this was very appropriate, and it is like that. It's like a horror show in some respects. How badly all of that wound up being done before it was all said and done, including, for example, the idea that the gloves, which are the infamous bloody gloves, if they don't fit, you must acquit gloves, actually were the thing that was opened very soon after the OJ Simpson reference sample spillage occurred. And so, as you see from my stock photo I'm using here, it's like, what are you doing? You could easily these gloves were blood soaked already, and so it was obvious that they were extraordinarily important to the case. And how could you possibly even mishandle this key evidence in this way? It's just a very, very unfortunate. So here's a short summary. So there weren't written protocols for how to do evidence collection and how to handle samples in the laboratory and how to do chain of custody. These weren't properly documented. There was this history of contamination problems in the laboratory. There's this failure to change gloves both at the crime scene and in the lab. There was a failure to dry samples completely. One of the things that you get in these cases, in any case actually, is the first thing that happens is the samples need to be dried, because otherwise you get bacterial contamination or fungal contamination, basically eats the samples up. So you have to, the first thing you do in biological samples is, from a crime scene, is you dry them out so that they are properly preserved. As I said, these OJ Simpson alleles, the DNA basically consistent with OJ Simpson was found on the rim of the samples from the victims from the autopsy. There was incomplete initial evidence collection as well. Some of the evidence was collected right away. Some of it was collected the following month. And there was just generally very, very poor documentation across the board. I called out Mr. Paradas, who in the collection of the Simpson reference DNA, but reference blood. However, he was not alone in having a poor documentation of what he was doing throughout the case. So that really was a problem. The other thing that happened was that this was a time when DNA, as we know it today, where you get statistics up in the 1 in a trillion, or whatever, that the chance of a sample coming from someone else other than the suspect. This was not, those kinds of statistics weren't possible using the DNA profile or methods of the time. And in addition, what you had in these cases were oftentimes mixtures where the blood spots that were found, and here you can see some of the blood spots found inside the Bronco. As I remember, I mentioned the car chase. Well, here you can see what at least 10 places around the inside of the Bronco where there was blood found. There was one very key one here found on the steering wheel. That wound up being a major point of potentially being blood that was a mixture of O.J. Simpson's and the victim. Actually, the theory was that it was a mixture of Simpson and his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson. However, unfortunately, again, this was a time when some of the methods were still being developed, and the way in which it was being presented was in very, very many ways misleading. So let's take a look at some of the specific results that occurred from here. So again, we're looking at this one sample here that was from the steering wheel, and what was analyzed. And so they did what is called polymarker. They did RFLP, and they did DQ alpha. So RFLP was something that didn't involve something called the polymerase chain reaction. That is PCR, which allowed the amplification of DNA, the multiplication of it, so that you could take a tiny amount of sample and make a lot of samples, so you do deep analysis on it. RFLP did not use that kind of approach. You had to have enough sample to basically put the DNA out on a gel, and you get a particular pattern that actually has pretty good statistics associated with it. It's not quite as high as modern STRs, but it's pretty good. But you needed to have a lot of sample to do RFLP. But if you had small sample, which is generally what was going on here, you had little tiny dots of blood, you had to use some kind of PCR technique. And the markers that were available at the time, DQ alpha was used very commonly. And this polymarker was basically a set of 6, I believe, marker systems where you could say, you could look at each one, and then you could multiply. They were independent variables, and so you could multiply the statistics associated with each one to determine kind of how unique a particular person was, and then the likelihood that they contributed to the evidence as well. And so that's what they did for that steering wheel sample, and for some of the other key evidence in the case as well. So here's an example of it. So let's just take let me see if I can get back to this to the slide that I want to show you with that. So this is a polymarker called LDLR. So for the evidence showed alleles of A and B. What that means is you inherit one from your father and one from your mother. So you have 2 types of markers at each allele. And this evidence shows AB. As it turns out, all the potentials that were being looked at, including OJ and both victims, were ABs as well. So there's basically no information in the LDLR because you couldn't distinguish anybody from, anybody could have been a contributor to this sample. There are other kinds of people with other kinds of profiles at LDLR who could be eliminated, but that was not possible here with any of the 3 people that they were looking at. So for the next one, GYPA, the evidence showed AB for that. OJ Simpson was a BB. Now a BB could contribute to an AB as long as there was an A type person around. So both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were either had an A allele at GYPA. So it's very possible that this shows a mixture, right? A mixture of OJ Simpson BB and one or both of the victims as well. In any case, if OJ Simpson were associated with this sample, somebody else would have had to be associated with it as well. It had to have been a mixture if you assume that OJ Simpson contributed to it. So that's GYPA. Let's look at the next one, HBGG. Here, the evidence shows A, B, and C, which I think is all the combinations that polymarker could look at for this particular locus. So for HBGG, Simpson was a BC, Nicole Brown Simpson was an AB, and Ron Goldman was an AA. So this indicates, first of all, because it has three alleles here, it backs up the idea that it's a mixture because one person can only contribute two. So at the very minimum, this is showing one piece of interesting information. This spot was a mixture. It was at least two people must have contributed to it in order for it to have an ABC a set of alleles, and that's consistent with a mixture of one of the victims or both of the victims with OJ Simpson. It's actually, interestingly, not consistent with a mixture of Simpson with Ron Goldman alone, because Ron Goldman was an AA. Well, actually, it is, and Simpson was a BC. So Goldman could have contributed the A, while Simpson did the BC. So actually, it's consistent with any of the combinations of two or three of the people here, but it also would be consistent with almost anybody on the planet, really, because of the limitations of the polymarker system. At D7S8, the evidence was AB. Simpson was AB. Nicole Brown Simpson was an AB, and Ronald Goldman was a BB. Again, not a whole lot of information we're getting out of these at this point, other than the fact that we know that it's a mixture. Here with GC, again, we show that it's a mixture because we've got three alleles. And again, most combinations were consistent with that. So again, it could not have. One interesting thing here is the blood spot could not be only from Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, because neither one of them could contribute to B. As it happens, OJ Simpson could have contributed to B. So this might be something here for them to do, for them to say. And then the most important one was DQ alpha, because it was the one that you could see the most different kinds of alleles, and so the population statistics were stronger than any of the others in the polymarker system, any of the ones in the polymarker system. The one disadvantage they had here is that what they found was an allele called 1.1 and an allele called 4. What they didn't know, however, just couldn't know based on the technology at the time, is whether 1.2 of what is called a 1.2 allele could also have been in the evidence as well, because the 1.1 allele, in the way in which the instrument reports, would mask the 1.2. So you can't assume whether the 1.2 is there or not based on the 1.1, because the 1.1 was there. So it was either the evidence that DQ alpha was either 1.14 or it was 1.1, 1.2, and 4. So this was interesting too. OJ Simpson was a 1.1 and 1.2, like his ex-wife. So they could have been contributing the 1.1 and 1.2 over here. Don't know in that regard, but they couldn't have contributed the 4. As it turns out, Ron Gold. This is a really interesting piece of evidence here, in the sense that Ron Goldman was a 1.3 and 4. So there was no 1.3 in the evidence. There was a 4, but because Ron Goldman was a 1.3, he's now excluded from having been a contributor to the evidence. There is any kind of discordant allele is enough to eliminate somebody as having contributed to the evidence. There were no discordant alleles for Nicole Brown Simpson or OJ Simpson in any of the things I just showed you. So they were never excluded from being a contributor to the sample. Ron Goldman here was excluded by the DQ alpha because the 1.3 wasn't there. One of the things that's interesting, though, is if the sample was if OJ Simpson or Nicole Brown Simpson or both of them were contributors to the sample, then there must be somebody else as well, because neither one of them could contribute the 4. So the 4 is interesting here in that sense, as being, kind of it's suggestive that somebody other than OJ Simpson or Nicole Brown Simpson had contributed to the sample, but we don't know. It was a mixture, but we don't really know. And so, and that is a mystery, actually. That's not yet, as far as I know, been resolved, and I don't even know whether anyone has ever attempted, whether the material was preserved and modern STRs were ever used with it. Don't know. I'd be really curious to find out. Now, here's where it's important to understand some of the vagaries and the technical details of DNA population statistics, and how the miscommunication of that could really be misleading. And this is where again the defense really had a point here, and the prosecution did produce what I feel were some misleading characterizations of the evidence that really undermined the case. And the jury even said so. The jury did hear a testimony about the statistics I'm about to talk to you about, and they weren't convinced. They honestly they believed that in the garbage in, garbage out anyway. That was they were discounting everything anyway. But the statistics problem wasn't well described to them, and so that was also detracted from the prosecution's case. Just regardless, they knew something was wrong. I'm sure none of them were an expert in DNA population statistics in 1995. But in any case, so here's the DQ alpha, OJ Simpson 1.1.2, and so on and so forth. So the question is not how common is OJ Simpson's profile here? So there's two questions you could ask. Is OJ Simpson unusual? And therefore, is it unusual that he might have contributed to this sample? Or the more salient question, the more important question is, what are the odds that OJ Simpson contributed to the sample versus somebody else out in the world? Okay. And so this evidence, which is 1.1, 1.2, and 4, is the potential alleles that were in the evidence. So here are all the different kinds of individuals and their DQ alpha profile that could have contributed to that pattern. You could have a 1.1, somebody who's exclusively 1.1. They could be there. You could have somebody who, like the Simpsons, were 1.1, 1.2s. You could have somebody who was a 1.14, because that combination fits in here. You could have somebody who's exclusively a 1.2, somebody who is a 1.24, and somebody who is a 4.4. Any of those 6 combinations could contribute to this evidence pattern. That is actually almost half the population. So 45% of Caucasians and 59% of African Americans fall within one of these 6 DQ alpha allele types. And so even if 1.1.2, what the Simpsons had, it only is something like, I don't know, something like 10%, 10% of the population. That's not the relevant statistic. The relevant statistic is how many, all these 6 kinds of people could have contributed to the evidence, and that's roughly half of human beings, or half of Americans, because the population statistics were based on American population groups. And so here's the issue. So for the evidence, the PCR testing, even if you count all that polymarker stuff, would include roughly half the people in the evidence. And by half the people, I mean half the people in America could have contributed to the evidence just based on the DNA alone. The sample, however, is different. And this is where the prosecution tried to say, well, this is what the relevant statistic is, and that is OJ Simpson's profile can be seen only in 1 in 26,000 people. In other words, if you add up all of the odds of everything I just showed you from the polymarker system, what OJ Simpson's DNA was, well, that's relatively unique. Only one person in 26,000 has that. All of those combinations in all of those polymarkers in DQ alpha added up. But that's irrelevant, right? Because you could also, test him against all the STRs and his and build up statistics of 1 in quadrillion. But that doesn't mean that that's the relevant statistics as to whether he would have, the possibility that he contributed to the evidence. So this 1 in 26,000 figure is really grossly misleading. The relevant figure is, what are the odds that he contributed to the evidence versus somebody else out in the world? And that's basically 50-50. So about half the people in the world would be implicated by the evidence. So all of this kind of added up and to serious questions during the trial about the DNA, about all of what happened at the crime scene, what happened with the reference sample, what was going on generally with respect to the practices of the Los Angeles Police Department at this time when it came to how they did business. And they decided that they needed to um, uh, uh, respond to this because it became very clear before the trial that these questions of contamination were going to be raised. And so this is the third part of the story that for us to talk about today, and that is so what if Philip Van Adder had given the vial to Mark Furman, or himself had contaminated evidence on purpose using the reference sample from OJ Simpson? Is there a way to figure that out, to actually do a test that would determine that? Well, as it turns out, as in most cases for medical samples, there's a preservative that is preloaded into the vial to do things like prevent the growth of bacteria and that kind of thing that would break down the sample. And that preservative is called EDTA. And so if somebody just took some of the blood from the test tube and spread it around a crime scene, you should be able to detect the EDTA in that sample, in the crime scene sample. And so this was what LAPD decided to do, is to see, well, can we figure out whether there was EDTA in the sample? Now, one of the key issues is then, well, maybe there's EDTA anyway in somebody's blood. Is there what is called endogenous EDTA in samples anyway? After all, we live in a culture that's full of preservatives, right? I mean, we're basically pre-embalmed before we die in some respects. And EDTA is in a bunch of foodstuffs. In fact, there's a fair amount of EDTA in Big Macs, or at least it was in the 90s. I don't know whether there still is, but there was in the 90s. And that's relevant because apparently OJ Simpson, the day before the murders, had actually had a lunch or something like that at McDonald's and had a Big Mac. And so therefore, it's possible his blood would have had some EDTA in it anyway, but not nearly the same quantities that you would have in that test tube. And whether those were detectable using the methods of the time is also somewhat questionable. But in any case, this is the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. This building was not open at the time of the O.J. Simpson trial. They actually opened this building up in the 2000s. They call it the Battleship. This is a very nice laboratory. They were kind of stuck off in the corner by the FBI before that. They're very cramped quarters and that kind of thing. But they were still the FBI laboratory, and they had developed a technique for looking at this very question: can you detect EDTA in a blood sample? And this is actually the paper that was published in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology by the folks from the FBI laboratory involved in the Simpson case and in the research work in EDTA. This was actually published in 1997, so this was a few years after the trial. They had not published this work in the open literature at this point. It's really interesting because what you see here, there's several important names. The two that were important during the trial were Bruce Bedoli, who ran basically the research unit at the laboratory. Bedoli still is active in research. He did enormously important work in helping the FBI develop DNA forensics, really a giant in the field in that regard. Roger Martz, though, was the operational guy who actually did the EDTA analysis. And unfortunately, did not give appropriate credit, really, to the FBI lab during his testimony. Although I will say, probably the person, and I don't know this, probably the person who did the most work is Bruce McCord, who of these people, in terms of the people I know, I actually know McCord and Bedoli. McCord is the best analytical chemist of these four, in my view. Really amazing analytical chemist. He left the FBI laboratory after this, just like Bedoli did, to go off into doing research, and I believe is still doing research still as well. So they developed this set of techniques to look at this issue of, can you detect trace amounts of EDTA in a blood sample, so you can determine whether somebody is planting evidence. So here's the two gentlemen. This is Martz. This is a picture of him from the trial, Roger Martz. And this is Bruce Vidoli, the gentleman from the research unit who had worked with Martz, but who Martz said he really didn't use his work. He did his own technique to do the EDTA. So there was a bit of a match. There was a kind of a disagreement, kind of a bureaucratic problem within the FBI laboratory that was revealed by this particular issue with the EDTA. And so, just so you understand some basics, I'm not going to go into too much detail about chromatography. So the basic idea being is that the blood actually has obviously a lot of constituents in it. What you want to do is you want to separate out those constituents and then measure them in some way that allows you to identify them. And so chromatography lets you do that. You introduce a sample. In this case, the purple represents sample introduced into this column of material as the sample goes through. So the red in this case goes through a little faster, is able to move through the material a little faster than the blue. And so what you get is you collect the red earlier than the blue, and that allows you to separate out samples. This is common in industrial processes as well as in basically huge numbers of analytical chemistry processes. Very commonly done. The instrument that they used, this is comparable at least to the type of instrument that was used by Martz in the FBI laboratory at the time. So after they separated out, they did mass spectrometry, where they basically bang it with some electrons and split apart the molecules and then measure the different fragments in order to determine what the chemical makeup was. So here's the different fragments that you might see with EDTA. The 293 ion, which is the EDTA intact, seldom seen because you're trying to ionize, and so when you ionize it, you're going to break it apart a little bit. So the common ions you see is 247, 132, and 160. These are the three main ions that you would see, and what that looks like in the output is something like this. So what you have is the 132 here, you have the 160 here, and you have the 293 over here. So those are three characteristic peaks of EDTA. So they put it through a chromatography machine to separate things out, and then they look for this pattern to see whether it's there. And unfortunately, they got ambiguous results, of course, because everything in this case was kind of snake bit from a forensic science perspective in some respects. But on the other hand, they were also trying a completely new technique. So the idea is that if they were going to make this work, they were going to have to really work hard to do everything exactly right. And unfortunately, Martz was too sloppy. He hadn't been in the laboratory a lot. He was really a supervisor. He should have brought in and worked more closely with the research people and with his own staff to make sure that everything was done correctly. Unfortunately, he got ahead of himself. He had been in management too long, in my view, to have taken on this level of a technical task. So here is Q204, which was a sample from the rear gate of the Ford Bronco. It showed 293 and 160 ions present, and that's consistent with EDTA, but it didn't show the 132 ion, right? So what does that mean? Not sure. Was that because it was EDTA from the Big Mac? Or was this planted evidence? Don't know. Q2, 205 and 206 were from the socks. So there were blood stains found on the socks from OJ Simpson's home, and those were consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson. And so, again, the 293 and 160 ions were present, consistent with EDTA, and the 132 ion was missing there as well. Martz actually tested himself as kind of a validation of the method and did not add any EDTA. And this is what he saw. He saw similar results. And then finally, he took samples from the victims and from OJ Simpson, or actually not from Ron Goldman, I don't believe, only from Nicole Brown Simpson, OJ Simpson, and himself. He spiked those with EDTA, and he saw the classic EDTA signature there, 132, 160, and 293. But in his report, he basically said no EDTA was found in these samples, at which that's an interpretation. In some respects, it's a reasonable interpretation of the samples of these results, but it's questionable because this 293 and 160 ion, what the heck are they? There was a lot of weird speculation that Martz put out there about which chemistry this could be consistent with, and he really did not have a good answer for what that was. The On behalf of Simpson, this gentleman testified. This is Fred Reeders, who also was an extraordinary analytical chemist. Among the people who do forensic chemistry, Fred Reeders is also a legend, and so he was one of was the prime mover in the founding of what is now the most important commercial laboratory doing like forensic toxicology and chemistry and things like that. And he said what his view was when he testified was the 293 and 160, that's good enough. That shows EDTA. And the test, and he said, well, the test can be variable. What you're doing is you're doing a test where a lot depends on the instrument conditions and things of that nature. You're going to have some variability with respect to which ions show up. And he really faulted Martz for not doing an internal standard, which is pretty standard approach in doing analytical chemistry. And as a result, he's like, the testing itself was questionable in any case because that and other kinds of things were not done properly, as we'll see in a minute. Now, Martz also testified in the case, of course, and was reluctant to do so because he fully understood that the results could be interpreted exactly as Reeders indicated, as showing that there was EDTA in crime scene samples that really raised the question of potential contamination. And the jury really reacted badly to Martz. The fact of the matter is, it did not go well. His testimony did not go well. It showed that he had done very poor practices in terms of how he had collected the data, how he had not preserved it, how he had done poor note taking. It was poor. So after the fact, the FBI Inspector General actually reviewed Martz's work on the case, including his testimony. And this is what they noted: deficient record keeping, poor note taking, failure to save the digital files. So the defense had asked for the raw data, basically, of the scans. And they were like, no, we didn't save those. It's hard because you have a tape backup system, and the tape backup system was cranky. So we didn't save the digital files. I can show you the printouts, but I can't show you the digital files. They also said that he failed to properly credit the research division, Bruce Berdoli and Bruce McCord, and those fellows for the work they had done to develop the method. He was arrogant and dismissive toward the defense counsel during the testimony. He changed his demeanor before and after a break. Before the break, he said a lot of yes or no questions, and afterwards he said, well, I felt like I needed to say more than what I was saying. And so I gave more elaborate answers. And that also turned off the jury, because they're like, what is this guy about? He's like, it just seemed weird. And he did some basic mistakes as well. For example, he did not know what pharmacokinetics was, which is basically how the study of how drugs are metabolized in the body. He didn't know what that was, which was important because how EDTA is metabolized in the human body is important to understanding the implications of whether it was important whether OJ Simpson had a Big Mac, and that was why there was EDTA running around. And so he didn't even know what pharmacokinetics was. And even more fundamentally, he misstated the value of pi, which, kind of an odd, just one of those, it's just kind of, I'm piling on here now at this point, but I'm just telling you what the Inspector General said. they did conclude this. We find no basis to conclude Martz committed perjury or misled the jury or defense in the Simpson case, nor do we conclude that Martz improperly erased digital data from his results. This idea that he didn't preserve the digital data files for the defense counsel. We do conclude that because of his lack of preparation, his deficient record keeping and note taking practices, and certain aspects of his presentation and demeanor at trial, Martz poorly represented the laboratory and the FBI in this case. And that's, to say the least, unfortunate. So this was the result. The end result was that Simpson was found not guilty. I really want to call your attention over here because it says that this was talking to the jurors afterward. Group agreed with forensic expert Henry Lee, this as who that was, that there was something wrong with the prosecution's evidence. Opportunities for contamination are cited. So the jury is sometimes given a kind of a bad rap because it seems kind of obvious that Simpson was the murderer and that he got off in this case because he had the best lawyers and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, like I say, garbage out, garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage in, what's going to happen is the garbage out is what's going to happen. And so you can fault the jurors, but the jurors got it in some respects. There was not justice in this case in terms of the criminal trial and how it was all handled. But the fault doesn't lie with the jurors. The fault lies in the end with the people in the LAPD who mishandled the evidence and completely undermined the case from the very, very beginning. And it couldn't be saved by Roger Martz or by anybody else. The one thing that actually is some saving grace is this gentleman. This is Fred Goldman. This is Ron Goldman's dad, who has made it his cause in life to see that his son sees some level of justice with respect to at least what this world can offer. He actually brought a civil case against Simpson and won that civil case. And in that case, what happened was instead of some of the incompetent forensic science work that was done in the criminal trial, this gentleman came on the scene. This is Bill Bodziak. Bill Bodziak is basically could be considered the godfather of shoe print evidence. And what happened was, and this goes back to that Buffalo Bills game, okay, a few months before the murder, when OJ Simpson was quite happy. And this is when he made his biggest mistake, and it was found by this gentleman, Bill Bodziak. So here is that walkway again. And if you look closely, what you'll see is there are some footprints on that walkway. And so there you can see what I think is one of the footprints. But Bodziak, there was some good photography done of different parts of that walkway. And here's another one. This is a nicer version of a shoe print that was found around the crime scene. And that shoe is from a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe, which was exactly the same as the shoe that OJ Simpson was wearing here. This is a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe. During the criminal trial, Simpson said, I don't have a Bruno. What the heck are you talking about? I don't have a Bruno Magli shoe, whatever. And I don't know, I'm size 12, or I don't know if I'm size 12. And so he basically denied this. As it turns out, Nicole Brown Simpson had actually bought these shoes for him, and Bill Bodziak, after the fact, was able to find this picture of O.J. Simpson, identified that this was a Bruno Magli shoe, established that he had a size 12, and that it matched up to the crime scene impressions. And this is a very unusual shoe. This is not you're just normal sneakers and Keds or whatever. A Bruno Magli shoe, a size 12. Apparently, there was like a couple of dozen made in the entire world. So while it does not absolutely, like DNA say that, OJ did it, it sure as heck says that his shoe was found to have made bloody prints at the crime scene on the night that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered. That was established, and that played a huge role in the civil trial in which O.J. Simpson was found liable for the murders, and for which he still is owing money to the family of the victims, and to Fred Goldman, and the legal ramifications of that continue right down to the present day in 2023, because Fred Goldman, God bless him, hasn't let it go. He has been more on top of bringing what we want, which is justice, to the two victims. Again, there's no such thing as perfect justice in this world, but there is such thing as competent justice. And if you, I hope, get out of this video that there is such thing as garbage in and garbage out, and it's important because when people are murdered, you should take your job very, very seriously. And when you're not following the very, very best procedures, even when you have emerging technology, new technology, all the work in the world is not going to make up for the fact that garbage in and garbage out. So with that, and with the unfortunate deaths of those two individuals and the lack of justice that they found from the criminal justice system, we'll close. I hope you got something out of that video. I certainly enjoyed presenting it to you.